I might start by asking you about the title of your new collection of essays, Notes on Distant Influence. Maybe it's just me, but when I read Distant Influence, I thought, well, this is almost antithetical influence, but from far away, maybe. And as I read your collection, it became quickly apparent to me maybe what you mean by that, because you were talking about different kinds of influences on your work by friends and relatives, also authors long dead, and but people who might be far away from you in terms of time or space. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about that notion and when it became apparent to you that this collection of essays had that thread in common.
Sure. That's a tall order. It is experiments in distant influence. And you know, I wasn't thinking of like all the many influences on me from a distance. I was really thinking of, it was almost like I was playing a game with another poet, Tanya Gunvaldsen-Klassen, whom you know. And she said, let's do this thing where we work, you influence me, I influence you, but we're at a distance. And so we'll write at a particular time of day. So we did that for a little while. And we would write at the same time every day, but we were at a distance. And so I don't know what we expected to grow from that, but it was very interesting to try it. So it was an experiment in and of itself. And as for the other influences, I don't think I was really aware of them. They just, you know, you're having so many conversations with books that you've read, as well as people that you know. So there are all of those things that you try to gather into. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And your book, now tell me about Murmurations and how it emerged for you as a book.
Well, so it's a collection of poetry, and I think very quickly, as I'm sure you've experienced, sometimes we write poems and then we can see very quickly where they're going. Sometimes we just write poems for a few years and then it occurs to us that we could assemble them into a collection. But very early on I had the sense that I wanted to explore a few things, namely love poetry, but also poetry about the natural world. And I also saw the potential for this book as kind of an extended meditation on communication and human language and sound and music and noise and resonance, and where these categories overlap and where they're distinct from one another.
So I'm really interested in just what you were talking about, language and, you know, the possibilities that are inherent in language. That was one of the things that you were exploring in this book. And so one of the things that you come up with is this idea of naming. Over and over again, you look at words and names, and as if they're not quite enough. In one poem it says, I say brother, but that's not what I mean. And it comes up again and again. And then in the epigraph by Don Mackay, he talks a little bit about that names touch but a tiny portion of a creature, place, or thing. So can you talk a little bit about that, the fact that names don't really conjure up everything?
Well, I think specifically within the context of love poetry, I wanted to examine the position of the lover and the beloved and pay some attention and kind of recognize that even in a very intimate relationship, there's only so much we can really know another person. And I didn't read that Don Mackay quote until after I had a draft of the manuscript working, and I was reading that book Vis-a-Vis, which also came out with Gaspereau Press, which is a book of essays on nature and poetry. And this is also something you've talked about in the first essay of your first essay collection, The Marram Grass. There's communication that stands outside of human language. And so we have human communication, which is sometimes language, which is sometimes, you know, our human words, and sometimes that fails us. And so as a kind of counterpoint to that, I was looking to the natural world, as I see that you and Don Mackay and a lot of other poets have, to examine examples of resonance in sound and communication that don't have to do with our human language, as a kind of mirror but also counterpoint, I suppose. And so within love language, there's within a love relationship, there's a lot of beautiful expression, but there are also points where we fail each other, and that's, you know, points of
Yes.
tension and misunderstanding.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, it makes me think of your poem, and it's titled Missed Call.
The house sparrow carries sunlight in her beak. Consider the mystery. The slight frame burgeoning with hymns against the backdrop of still melting snow, blue and white pooling in the long given out grass. Under cedars I walk and whisper, attempt forgetting, but her notes are pressed upon my mind. Her flesh moves over me, probes my body. I don't expand like she does, but I no longer split from wanting. Her call rushes my insides, sears my chest, tests my resilience. I try her song, but my throat fails, feeble. And would you hear me anyway? I imagine your arms in another version of winter, deep in snow drifts, limbs and torso smudged in effort and evening. You catch everything as I see it, while I am still here, rasping. But her notes envelop my mind's soft ear, her flush. But her notes still surface in my mind, her flush. But her notes are stamped upon my mind, her flush. But her notes sink into my mind, her flush. But her notes become fixed in my mind, her flush.
So I'm so interested just from what you've said and thinking about that poem, and then so we have the poem, and then we have this kind of lovely thing that happens at the end. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, the form of that poem, Missed Call, which is maybe a third of the way into the collection, was a bit of an accident, because I was working on a draft of that poem, which is in couplets, and there was a turn of phrase I wasn't quite satisfied with. But then I was going to be publishing the poem in Canadian Notes and Queries, and I was working with Madhur Anand, who's the poetry editor there, and she had a question about the same turn of phrase that I wasn't quite sure about. And so I sent her my notes, and that the way that poem is formatted actually reflects the way I work on my drafts. So sometimes I'll have at the bottom of the page, you know, an asterisk and then alternate phrasings for the bit of the poem that I'm not sure about. And so I sent her all my alternate phrasings, and there were quite a few, and she suggested we keep them in the poem. And so that's how the poem was published.
Yeah.
And I think we also both liked the way it kind of looked almost like musical notation. And I also like about that form that it reflects kind of an echo. It creates kind of an echo within the poem. And when I read that poem in public or online, I do say those lines at the end. I do share them as a kind of echo to the body of the formal poem, the actual poem. On the question of form, I wanted to ask you, so this is a book of essays, but you're also a poet, and one of the things I love about your poetry is that you really don't shy away from formal experimentation. And so it wasn't really a surprise to me that there are traces of this in your book of essays. I wonder if you can speak to the form of the essay and maybe any of the influences for you on the way you approach form in essays.
I'd been working with somebody, and she was writing essays, and she wanted to experiment with the essay, and and I thought, how do we begin to do that? You know, how do we start? And so I wasn't looking at particular. I think there were some particular essays, but I can't remember them now. But it's almost like you had to invent. You know, what can the essay do, and what can it not do? Well, it just seems so elastic. You know, it seems like it can do almost anything if you try it. So there's one essay in this book that it was an essay about trees, about forests, you know, and I thought, oh, this is kind of a boring essay. And it really was kind of boring. And then I thought, what if it had clear cuts in it? What if you actually put the clear cuts and you cleared away the words and you took out the words? And so people had to sort of Most of the time the clear cuts don't affect the sense, but towards the end I start taking out the
Yes.
actual sense.
Yes.
And so it's just fragments that you get on the page. So I guess what I'm saying is the form is so elastic, you can play with it, and you can make it go in all kinds of directions. And so you asked me before, what are those poems at the end of Tree, No Tree? And I said to you, I don't know about those, show me those poems, because I really didn't know. And you said, oh, it could be a poem, this could be a poem. And I think that's where you get the malleability of the essay form. It could be a poem, but it also could be an essay.
Absolutely, and I think part of me will continue to think of them as poems, I have to be honest. But it's a beautiful essay, and I was quite moved by it. In it, you have an interesting analysis of kind of the common perception of poetry as not being very useful, and yet you point to its power. And what you're pointing to specifically is an ecological action led by poet Susan McCallan in BC that involved other poets. And I wonder if you can talk about that uselessness, but also the power of poetry.
Yeah. It was Susan McCaskill did a really interesting, so I'll talk about that first. Susan McCaskill did this really interesting eco activism kind of thing, but using poetry. And so she called on poets across Canada. I think she got submissions from Australia, the UK, you know, all over the place. And to save a piece of forested land in Langley, BC, she and her husband printed out the poems and hung them in sleeves on the trees that were likely to be cut by developers if the plan was to go ahead. And so I thought, isn't that an interesting way of protesting? You know, it's just an unusual but powerful protest. So poetry doesn't really do a whole lot, but it did capture some media attention, and through that media attention, a woman who had once picnicked in this forested area, she thought, they can't develop that land. That was where my husband and I used to go when we were just teenagers, and we'd have picnics there. Sorry. Yeah, so she really did something quite marvelous. You know, they saved the land.
Absolutely.
And they saved it through poetry.
Through poetry, yeah.
But I was also thinking of, you know, that poetry, I think in one of the essays I'm talking about, I think it was Auden who said that poetry doesn't do anything. And then he goes on later on in that particular poem, he goes on to say it doesn't do anything, but it can change things. You have as if to say you have a choice about things. So I think that's its power.
Okay. It's very moving, and a wonderful, a beautiful example of poets kind of thwarting that notion that poetry doesn't do anything.
Yeah, it was so beautiful and strong for me that it could do something. And then this was a panel that I was on for the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and so there were a bunch of people on the panel, and my piece was all about this poetry activism that had happened in Langley, BC. And then I was followed by a woman from the TD Bank, and she said, well, poetry is all very beautiful and nice, as if to dismiss it entirely. You know, it's just like, let's get down to brass tacks, let's get down to money business.
Yes, and I love that section, and that you have that after she starts talking, you just have the sentence brass tacks, and I thought, what an apt metaphor. I can hear it, you know, I can hear it in the room. And so that's one of the pieces that I considered a poem, I think, both because of the form, but also because of that sort of succinct but very evocative language within it. One last question about the form. So you mentioned that you have the sections of this essay at the end where you've really started to take out enough of the language in imitation of a clear cut, but to the extent that the sense of the paragraphs or the poems is lost. And I'm very curious to know, so do you have those other words? Did you kind of do an erasure on yourself, or did you purposely just kind of craft sort of meaningless, empty language for the end of the book,
It
for the
had
end of the
It
essay.
had meaning at one point.
Okay.
I ditched it.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, so I don't have it anymore, but the editor did want to see what it was.
Okay.
So it was really interesting
right.
that you know, she wanted the meaning there, and she wanted to be able to follow it, and I just thought, oh, it'd be so great if I just took it out, you know, took
Right.
it out, and then it's obscured, it's kind of erased, and even for me it's erased.
Yes.
So
okay.
it's just gone.
Wow.
And I don't know what I was, I know what I meant, but I don't know if the reader will be able to extrapolate from the essay. I hope so.
Well, it's certainly evocative nonetheless. There's something powerful about seeing those pages at the end with so many words missing, and then thinking of the trees as well, and the effect of that taking away in both spaces, the page and our forests.
Yeah, I didn't know until I actually saw it on the page that, oh, this changes a boring essay into something that's way more interesting.
It's not boring at all, that's for sure. It's not, I found it very compelling, and again, moving. Yeah.
Well, speaking of moving, I read here of Gold Arms, tell me if I'm getting the title wrong,
Sure.
Of Gold Arms, You.
Yeah.
And it's a line from Sappho, and so it moved me so much. Can you talk a little bit about that, but also about influences of women writers on your, on this particular book?
Sure. So that line is taken from Anne Carson's translation of a poem by Sappho. And the title, yes, is Of Gold Arms, You. And then I wrote a poem after it. And Sappho was a very obvious model for me in writing this book, but there were a few others as well. So I knew from the outset what I intended to do, which saved me some time and was great. I knew I wanted to write a book of love poetry, but I wanted very much to both play with the tradition that I had spent a lot of time digesting in school, as many of us have, and also look into the women who have gone before me, who have taken it upon themselves to write about romantic or erotic experiences, because I think there is necessarily something transgressive when women do it, including straight women, but also particularly queer women. And so Sappho is always a major model for me. She wrote, of course, some very sublime love poetry 2,700 years ago, and we're lucky to have as much of it as we do. But I was also looking into more contemporary voices like Carol Ann Duffy, the Scottish poet,
Right.
Audre Lorde, and I have epigraphs at the beginning of each section in the collection. I have two of them. One is from Sappho, one is from Anne Carson herself, one is from Audre Lorde, one is from Carol Ann Duffy. There's another one from Louisa Glick. And so I wanted to look to these women to see how they managed to create their own mode of love poetry. And I do think the mode changes immediately when a woman is speaking in it. And I think one of the things that I appreciate particularly about queer women writers like Audre Lorde and Carol Ann Duffy, also Arlene Paré, the Canadian poet, Colette Bryce, a contemporary Irish lesbian poet, is the space for questioning and kind of the way these writers claim the not knowing within love poetry in a more frank way than I find a lot of the traditional canonical male writers do. So that was something that I found particularly stimulating and something I wanted to explore in my own voice.
Yeah, and that's really powerful in your book, but also what I loved was that there are birds flying through this book. I mean, it's almost like a bird book in the way that you have them come in and out.
Great black-backed gull. We think we saw it. You were in the waves, your torso pressed to the board, letting go as they formed, their underbellies unrolling from the glint of post-dusk sky to frosted glass, bits of froth casting fish phantoms over the ocean floor. After a brief dip, I never left the towel, the tan pages of a library book sticking to my fingers. You yelled out from the water, pointing. Like any other gull, ordinary, its calls swallowed by the distance, remarkable only for its size. We second-guessed, the binoculars still under the passenger seat of your car, no nomenclature ready for our lips. We tried later in the bookstore, heads bent over the species guide, unfolded like a takeout menu in our hands. the bird at once singular and improbable because of how clearly it appeared to us.
At one point, you're noticing a gull on the beach. I can't remember the name of that poem, but
I think Great Black-backed Gull.
that's it, yes. And so can you talk about the birds and how they were inspiration for Murmurations?
Right. Well, coming back to this question about meaning and communication and sound, I think birdsong is a very obvious and ubiquitous counterpart to human language, because we can look to birdsong as an example of communication that arrives without human language. And even a birdsong will mean something to us as humans. It has some resonance for us, even if we're a different species. And birds are also, they're everywhere, and every place that I inhabited while writing this book, there would be birds somewhere. And, you know, on the way here, I crossed several crows, and just birds are part of our everyday. And so in terms of thinking about communication and sound, other forms of it within the natural world, that's a very obvious example. And then the other thing is, I'm always interested in the bird as kind of a mirror for the poet, for the writer, for poetry as song, and then birds making songs in the world.
Yeah, it's very powerful.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, in fact, I felt like it was a book of murmurations.
I do think of the book as a murmuration, so it's nice to hear you say that. And I do think, and I'd be curious to know your thoughts on this as well, both as a poet but also as an essayist. You know, when you, I think any book of poetry, when you collect it together, hopefully it functions somewhat like a murmuration. There's some sort of web of communication and resonance and working together. Again, because this book is called Murmurations, and I had the murmuration, the double definition in the back of my mind as I was writing this book. So a murmuring sound, but also a flock of birds, or starlings in particular. That was a very obvious model, but I think, again, even in any collection of poetry, maybe in essays, I don't know what you would think about this, there's that function of working together, and once you assemble it appropriately, hopefully, pieces complement each other and speak to each other.
Yeah, they do, and they almost do without you really thinking about it, you know. They're, it's striking. There's a bird.
Yeah. Was there a point at which you felt like you were working on a collection? Did you start?
Yeah, so I had a lot of essays, or pieces, I guess, of essays. And I thought, well, these work. And then I thought, no, that one won't work, that one won't work. This one might, but I'd have to rework it. So it was a case of kind of cobbling together what I had and then thinking, what else do I want to do? So I wanted to write about community. I felt like that was really an important thing to do. And I wasn't sure quite how to do it. And then I thought, there are people in my life who are really important to me, and so I'd like to write about them. And through doing that, you know, it opens up community for me. So, for instance, accompanying somebody as he was dying, that for me, that was a real community right there.
That's one of the last essays in the book. It's a very beautiful essay about a friend of yours who was a photographer with whom you also collaborated.
Yeah, that's right.
So maybe first I'll ask about collaboration. What role would you say collaboration plays in your artistic practice?
It's kind of like doing a collage with somebody else, and you think, I don't know what sort of color or piece they're going to put down, but I have to respond to that. So a kind of artistic conversation that you're having, and there's the back and forth in that artistic conversation. So it's kind of fun. You know, he puts down a piece of red and I put down a piece of blue, and we think, oh, there's that. So collaboration can be really, really interesting. It can also be tough if you're the one collaborating second, so which I was with John Barrage. And so he did his photographs of glass, cropped them, and they're like abstracts. They're really beautiful. And then I had to come in with my poems. He wanted me to write poems, and I thought, I don't know what to do. So it was a long time coming before I, came up with something.
And you talk about that process in the book, and I think you communicate very well how daunting it was for you, maybe especially because he was, suffering from a terminal illness. But that's a really beautiful essay, and you have some interesting remarks towards the end of it on vulnerability and standing in our own vulnerability as a source or a form of courage. And I wonder if you can talk about vulnerability in writing, because maybe this is just me, but the way you phrased it, it made me think of writing, and also particularly something like a personal essay where you have to be very vulnerable, but there's something certainly courageous in that, and then a contribution for readers and other writers.
Beyond the curtain surrounding John's bed, I could hear the cheerful voices of the nurses, not unlike the slightly raised voice my mother would use when talking to my grandmother on the phone, and the more subdued replies of the patients. John slept, woke, slept. When he woke, we talked for a few minutes before he drifted back into that far-off place that must have given him some relief. A new volunteer arrived and asked John if he'd like to work on an art project. He politely told her no, incensed by her invitation to make art. She could not have known that she'd been speaking to an accomplished photographer. Still, I understood his reaction as if I were the one in the hospital bed. He muttered that it felt as though she had infantilized him. None of the notes on John kept by the nurses or the palliative care team reveal anything about the person he was: prickly, intelligent, sensitive, humorous, imaginative, self-deprecating, an artist, a traveler poised between worlds. I think the flip side of courage is fear, and likewise, you know, if you're courageous in any, let me just say, you find your courage, and you probably find it in the midst of fear. And so I was really interested in John and his passage, you know, because he was afraid. He knew his death was coming. He could see it coming. He was enduring all of this pain because of the leukemia. And yet, there he was, you know, still working on his photographs. So it was kind of astonishing, you know, the creativity that was born out of that. And I think that was a courageous thing to do in the midst of being afraid of dying and not knowing when it was coming. That was, I think, the thing that worried him the most. He didn't know when it would come. He didn't know how painful it would be. So, you know, it was really, wow, it was really something to be there, to be on hand, and to sort of accompany him as he went through. There were lots of people accompanying him, but I was one of many. But it was pretty powerful stuff.
There's a similar journey you participate in, I think in the next essay, or shortly thereafter, in an essay that you wrote about your daughter Sarah and her diagnosis.
That's right.
When she was 26. She was diagnosed 26, 27 with multiple sclerosis.
That's right, yes. So she at first didn't know what was happening to her, so, and then she, you know, it was a month or so later that she was diagnosed, which is very fast to get a diagnosis like that. But just the world that she had to travel through to get to that point was really quite amazing. And so again, I was thinking, well, what sustains us in times like that, you know? And I was kind of watching her and kind of, you know, being there for her as much as I could, but also watching her, you know, and she taught me a lot about being courageous. And she said, well, it's just because I have to be. But there's hope too in the midst of that. You know, there's, if you start to succumb to grief, I guess, that's maybe the wrong path. It was for me. But if you can stay hopeful, then so many things can happen to the good.
I found that to be a really fine distinction that you made between, you know, the two possibilities that you had. You could either turn to grief or you could turn to hope in what was obviously a very difficult situation. And I believe you had, at that point, it was a friend who reached out to you, quite sympathetically, you know, thinking that you might be going through your own sort of grieving process with this new devastating news, obviously. But you were very precise in saying that, no, it was a moment for you to turn to hope.
Yeah.
I appreciated that a lot.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for reading it so closely. And the same, you know, it's what a wonderful book that you produced. You know, I feel like these Gaspereau books, they really are so beautifully made. And you know, just the paper, the feel of these books. So we're so lucky to have had them published by a press that really cares about that kind of thing.
Absolutely,
So.
absolutely.